your podcast for all SAE, FFA, and agriculture adventures. I'm Lila.
And I'm Natalie, and we're your hosts for this podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us. We have Mr. Marshall Sewell from Mind Your Melon. Marshall, we are so thankful that you could be able to come here and speak with us a little bit today on this podcast. If you could, just tell us a little bit about who you are.
Well, first off, thank you both so much for not only the invite, but thank you very much for what you're doing. Before you hit record, you were giving me a little bit more background on how this all got started, and I think it's super cool, just the way you're putting together these stories and sharing them with your community. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about me personally. I'm from your neck of the woods originally. Grew up in the Plant City area. Actually, raised more in the Dover area for anybody listening who might be familiar, but grew up on my family's multi-generational farm operation, growing berries and mixed vegetables. And like so many people in ag and in FFA, I just always knew that I wanted to be involved in ag. It was all I'd ever known. I grew up in farming. And so as soon as I got to middle school, I, I had one brother who's 2 years older, and I had already seen him go through FFA and everything. And so as soon as I stepped foot into Turkey Creek Middle School, I was ready. Like, I wanted my blue jacket and everything. I wanted to be on every team. I wanted to compete with him. And so I got really involved in FFA. And then over time, just, grew more and more passionate about agriculture. And here I am years and years later. I went on, was the state officer with FFA, and then studied ag business and food and resource economics up at University of Florida. And I've been working in the ag industry for a few years now. So it's it's been an interesting experience getting to work in this space, and it's something I'm very passionate about. And I'm excited to talk to you and all your listeners about it today.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, we're going to go ahead. Our first question is super simple. Being from Plant City, what is your favorite Plant City staple food? This could be a strawberry festival or just your favorite local food spot.
No contest. You go to Grandpa Johnson's, you get the smoked wings, get them Jacob style, maybe even ask for them a little extra done, a little extra crispy. Like, that's my go-to.
I'm gonna be honest, that's my go-to there at Johnson's. Oh my goodness, I love Johnson's. So that's actually a really good answer. So our next question for you, away from our icebreaker, is can you share your story behind your upbringing, Mind Your Melon, and your connection with agriculture? I know you talked about that a little bit, but go more in depth.
For sure. So I mentioned that my brother and I we were raised on our multi-generational farm operation. And so, to be specific, my brother and I are fifth generation. And so you're from Plant City, you'll get this. Your listeners might not, but Plant City, named after Henry B. Plant. Henry B. Plant came into town, brought the railroad. And the story goes, according to my family, that one of my ancestors came down on Henry B. Plant's railroad and was working as a telegraph operator at the train station. It was actually in Valrico, for anybody who's familiar with that, but working as a telegraph operator. And that's how he was able to scratch together enough money to buy his first bit of land and start farming. And that was how our family got started. And then fast forward generation and generation, my brother and I were raised there, growing strawberries, growing mixed vegetables. We do fall vegetables, winter strawberries, spring vegetables. And yeah, as I mentioned in the intro, I always knew I wanted to be involved in ag, competed in every contest pretty much that I could, and wanted to be a state officer. But things changed a lot for our family when I was a senior in high school. Uh, Farming, it's a very stressful business. There's a lot of risk that goes along with it. And our family was not immune to that, even though we'd been doing it for a long time. We had a rough season my senior year. We lost some plants, some strawberry plants, to a big disease outbreak. A lot of other farms in the area were dealing with that same thing. And just for a lot of different circumstances and things we won't necessarily ever fully understand, my dad made the decision to take his own life when I was still in school. And you're high school students. I mean, so you can think about that from your perspective, just, knowing what it's like for you going through school right now. And I was sitting in your shoes and sitting there thinking about how my mom and my brother and I were going to get through the loss of our dad while we kept this long time family tradition going of farming. And yeah, just also trying to really understand what in the world had just happened with my dad. And so what I like to say is I went on to UF and I studied economics, I studied business, and thought I was going to come back home to the family farm operation. And I ended up taking some twists and turns and working in the seed business and things like that. But I also really got interested in psychology. Never studied it, never got a degree in it, but I got really interested in just learning that I wanted to understand for myself, my own knowledge. I wanted to understand what my dad may have been dealing with, what he may have been going through, but I also really just wanted to try and understand how to be a better resource for other people. That was a big catalyst for it. And so I started studying it, and gosh, it was probably almost 10 years later before I really started talking openly and publicly about what happened. And that was because Hurricane Michael had gone through North Florida and South Georgia, had just ruined a bunch of farm and ranch operations. And some people that we know up in Georgia, they reached out directly and they said, "We know what happened with your family. We know that you don't really talk about it, but would you please come up here and talk to some people because they've lost everything and they are hurting. And can you just talk to them a little bit about what it's like to lose and what it's like to have hope after that?" And so went up there thinking that it was going to be just a pretty straightforward deal, go up and talk to some people, and that would be it. But got home and it was just like text message, phone call, email, one after another. And so I'm being long-winded. I'll wrap it up. But yeah, we ended up realizing that this whole farm stress, farm well-being issue was much bigger than just a local thing. And so my family and I chose to really start openly advocating for it. That has evolved over time into Mind Your Melon, which is our personal platform. Developed the podcast similar to yourselves, just trying to share stories and share resources for people. And yeah, it's continued to evolve. And I can tell you as much or as little as you want to know about the things we've been doing with Mind Your Melon. You tell me.
I think what you guys are doing is very interesting. Growing up, I've been around different mental health situations and stuff like that. My mom's entire job and all of that is diagnosing mental health within people. So it's something that I genuinely have just found interesting, just slightly because I've been surrounded by it. Being able to see where you've grown from that is something that's truly inspiring. And even though it was like a little bit down the line, you were able to have your own experiences still. You were able to grow up, but then you were also able to come back to that experience and do your best to help other people, which I think is truly a testament to who you are as a person and who your family is, because that's something that no person can imagine going through. And that's something that I think everybody should try and grow from, is being able to realize that something can happen, but what you make of that is truly the outcome of the situation. So, going on to our next question, what do you think makes mental health a unique challenge for those working in the agriculture sector compared to other industries?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to that. So what makes it different, I think, just first and foremost, you got to recognize that there's a lot of risk. And yes, there are plenty of other industries and fields where there's risk. Plenty of other people deal with risk. But I think when you start looking at there's environmental risk that goes along with farming, especially farming out in the open field, or you got your animals out in the open field. There's financial and market related risk, a lot of times outside of control. And then on top of that, too, you start factoring in these other layers of um, you know, that multi-generational nature that I mentioned earlier, especially when you start thinking like, yeah, there's a lot of pride in that, but it's also a lot of pressure on upcoming generations to keep the farm business going. It starts getting really wrapped up in people's identity. It surpasses being a job or a career, and it's kind of just who you are. And so it's you almost get to that point where, yeah, if I'm not farming or ranching, then who am I and what am I doing? And so it gets really wrapped up into your identity. And yeah, there's a lot of different challenges and stressors, but I do think that you've got a lot of inherent risk and then also a lot of kind of social, like psychosocial factors that go into it as well.
Right, right. The pressure that farmers face, I know, is a big deal, especially when I've talked to some of our older farmers that is like my family's personal friends, is like they never know how they can talk about mental health. They're older generation, they're like, I don't talk about that. I'm just gonna go out on my tractor and go work out on the farm and not focus on anything else. But then after talking to them, you realize how much stress and worry they have to go through. They're like, my dad did this, my dad's dad did this, and they're like, I'm supposed to carry on that tradition. And it just can get very stressful for these people. And now I completely agree with you. It's like every business or sector of jobs has a different way that they deal with mental health and stress. But I feel like agriculture, it's kind of like you're not supposed to talk about it, in some senses.
Well, and even the demand of farm life, like we love it. We do it because we love it. But then on top of that, it ends up being an every single day job. Like I think about that all the time. You're not working a 9 to 5 and you turn the phone off at the end of the day. I mean, if something goes wrong at the farm, you're dealing with it, and you're going home and you're continuing to think about it, and it's hard to find an off switch. And so yeah, there's a lot of pressure, and to your point, it is something that for the longest time people just didn't talk about. You you kind of you almost are made to feel like you got to be independent, you got to be autonomous, you suck it up and you get through it, and you shouldn't have to ask anybody for help, and then you end up just you bear a lot of that burden and you carry a lot of that pressure all on your own, and it can get pretty heavy.
Well, Mr. Sewell, how do you deal with the pressure of the farm that you've ever faced personally?
Well, and I do want to point out too, I mentioned my career is taking some twists and turns and stuff. So I'm not directly involved with the farm operation right now. My brother's doing the farm, and I still work in the seed business, and definitely like to support and help out as much as I can. But just speaking to stress management in general, I think there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. I think a lot of people really want like can you give me the 3 steps that I can take to de-stress my life and to get everything right? And is it is it deep breathing, or is it this, or is it that? And unfortunately, there's no quick answer. Um, I think a lot of it, and my wife and I talk about this a lot of times too, a lot of it ends up coming down to just making the proactive choice to tackle the hard things or tackle the hard questions or the hard conversations up front and work through them, as opposed to just pushing them off, pushing them off, pushing them off. And then also just everybody finds different things that works for themselves. I think for me, something that I really got to do, like, I've got to lean into my faith. I've got to really make sure that I see a sense of purpose, I see a sense of commitment and a sense of meaning to things. On top of that, I got to try and do my best to carve out a little bit of meaningful time for myself, even if it's just a little bit. I like to tell people that I'll try to make sure, even though some people don't like waking up early, I'll try to make sure and wake up in the morning before anybody in the house does, so that way I can read, I can exercise, I can get a cup of coffee and just like start my morning off right. And just helps me to start off with a sense of gratitude and start my day off on the right foot. And yeah, but it's different for everybody. And and you mentioned that your mom kind of works in this field and everything, so you've probably heard all about this before, but a lot of it is just, it's behavioral,
Mhm.
and making a behavioral shift when we are so used to our habits and the way we have always done things. That can be difficult sometimes. So I wish I could give you the perfect answer, the quick fix, but unfortunately, there's just not really a quick fix.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I've learned through just watching my mom is that there's never a quick fix. Anytime something happens and she gets a phone call, it's a different situation every single time without fail. She has like her giant book of everything that she needs in it, but sometimes genuinely there isn't an answer in there because there's never something that'll be the exact same situation every single time. And I think that's what makes mental health so difficult to not even talk about, but also express because you feel like your situation is significantly different than someone else's, but in reality, everybody's is different, but it just takes a little bit to realize that.
Hmm.
So going into that, talking about the fact that it's so difficult to be able to deal with it, what workshop, appearance, podcast episode, or speech have you given that you think has helped you advance the idea that maybe not everybody has the same situation, but it's helped you progress the idea that mental health needs to be talked about?
So it's interesting the way you framed up that question. So, and I thought you were going in the direction of like, do I have a certain one that stands out or a certain one I enjoyed or something? But your question is more so around, do I have a specific experience that makes me feel like we've really advanced the conversation? Did I hear that right?
Yes, sir.
I would say, and maybe I'm thinking of this too because it's just so recent, but um, we had a unique opportunity with Mind Your Melon to partner with Florida Farm Bureau, the University of Florida, and also with American Farm Bureau, uh, to help work on developing this study that was a first of its kind for the state of Florida. We were taking a study that was done in Georgia, carried out by Mercer Health up there, and it was this really well done study where they surveyed people within the farming and ranching community and started looking into stressors specific to the industry, coping mechanisms. So by coping mechanisms, I mean like the kind of things that people are doing to deal with stress. And some of those are good, some of those are bad. But then also the kind of resources that people within this community would be interested in. And I say all that just to say that we ended up having the opportunity to replicate that study in the state of Florida. And we just recently wrapped up our survey period. And the University of Florida team, they are now working on taking all that data that was collected and analyzing it. And so I can't really share anything about any of that yet. But what I will say is, you asked about, do I think we've done something to advance it? And I'll point out, we typically in ag don't really talk too openly about this subject. And also, if you've ever tried to get people from farming and ranching to take a survey, it's more difficult than you would think. And to just share a little on the research and data side, if you look at other countries and other areas who have tried to conduct a similar study, a lot of times you end up seeing where they were able to get 30, 40, maybe 50 people to actually participate in this study. And I can't share all the final numbers or anything yet until it's publishable, which will be later on in the early spring. But I'll just say the sheer number of people that we were able to get to participate in this survey on a weird topic and just take the time to commit and participate in the survey. I think that whenever all the data comes out and everything, it'll be really interesting to see the findings, and then also to just realize that we had that many people from across the state of Florida and within the industry who were willing to have the weird conversation or to participate in the survey when traditionally it's very difficult.
Yes, sir. So I just want to confirm this is the survey that y'all had on Instagram and is on your page, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we rolled it out back at the end of summer, early fall. And then to make it even more difficult, Kylie, we only had it open up through the beginning of November. And during that period, we not only was it just a busy time, but then on top of that, we had multiple hurricanes and tropical storms and everything else. And so people were under a lot of pressure, and so we weren't super sure how participation rates were going to be. And so to get the amount of people that we had to actually participate, and it's going to end up being great to have that data, because not only will that help us advocate on the topic at the state national level, but then it will also, the findings will help us to continue to develop more and more resources for people in Florida ag.
Yes, sir, definitely. I loved going on Instagram personally and looking at the survey, and I kept seeing y'all social media team keep putting it out there, keep trying to get farmers to fill it out. I almost wanted to fill it out just because of how much y'all kept putting it out there, because I just thought like it was so inspiring that y'all wanted to help them. Like y'all keep trying to help them, and you're putting all these resources out there for all of our farmers, all of our agriculturalists out there. And I remember talking to a few different of my family friends and like, maybe you should fill this out. Maybe you should check this out. Cause I know, especially after all these hurricanes that we faced, share your
Oh yeah.
story. And I really love that y'all are doing that, especially in the partnership with Farm Bureau and the University of Florida, because that's a big step in the right direction.
Hey,
Um,
we're trying, and thank you for telling people to take it. We appreciate it.
yes, sir, definitely. So our next question for you is going to be, are there any specific tools or techniques that Mind Your Melon provides to help farmers and ag professionals cope with stress and challenges? I know you talked a little bit about that survey, but is there anything else that you would like to add on?
Yeah, so I think too, we have to remember that starting from ground zero, we took a topic that people were not comfortable discussing. They were not even willing to really approach. And so, step number one, like you've got to just build awareness around it, kind of destigmatize the topic, and get people to the point where they're actually willing to have a conversation. And that alone has been a challenge to begin with. And so, then you asked, are there any specific tool or resources? We're excited because now that we're going to have all this data, we want to see what it points to in terms of what would be the most helpful for farmers. Because otherwise, we could spend a lot of time coming up with resources that just aren't used or aren't useful. But I'll say too, some of the other stuff that we really just advocate for in general, I mentioned earlier, encouraging people to tackle some of the hard questions and hard conversations early on. we, and by we, I mean our family and our board, we always talk about proactive versus reactive. A lot of the things end up, and we saw it firsthand on our family farm. We ended up in a scenario where we really didn't have a backup plan. We really didn't have a contingency. And then things started getting sideways. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, what are we going to do? And so then, even from a business planning standpoint, a people planning, financial planning, any of those, okay, let's start thinking about, the tough stuff. Let's think about what could go wrong. Let's think about the contingencies. And we end up seeing that a lot of times with farm and ranch operations too, just from the standpoint of succession planning, estate planning, things like that. You end up putting off difficult conversations around family business and things like that just because you don't want to have a difficult or an emotional conversation. And then later on something happens and you really like need to know what's going to happen with the business or what direction you're going to go in, and nobody's prepared for it. And it's really similar, I think, with just our individual well-being, our financial well-being, business well-being, any of those things, like encouraging people to start thinking a little more proactively about some of those tough things rather than just saying like, oh, that's a conversation that can wait till we really have to have it.
Hmm. If I'm understanding correctly, you're basically saying that as an individual, you have to make your own decision to be proactive with what you're doing. And once you figure that out, you'll be able to go out to other communities and people in your family to have those harder conversations, right?
For sure. No, and like I'm trying I'm trying to not get overly technical or anything, but like it's in psychological terms, we refer to it as doing introspection. And you can think introspectively about yourself. You can think introspectively about your business, but really spending the time to think about sort of what your current situation or scenario is, what you're dealing with, what you're going through, and what you may need.
Hmm.
And that's a lot of it is like sitting there, being honest, being vulnerable, being willing to start thinking about what you're going through, and what resources you have around you. And I mean, you may see it in your own communities or your own friend groups. Like
Hmm.
there's sometimes just scenarios where you just let things bubble and bubble and bubble until it's just it's kind of a little too late, and then it comes to a head.
Yeah.
And we're trying to
It's
avoid that.
yeah, it's kind of crazy to see the similarities even like on small situations between your friends and then going all the way to running a operation. There's two completely different things, but there's one thing in common is your own ability to just take a step back and reflect. And I think that's honestly one of the hardest problems that a lot of people have is just reflecting on what they're going through and being able to take that next step forward to see it because a person can realize that there's something going on, but if you just realize it, but then you're not taking any steps to progress it, you're just going to be in the same spot. So I think the
Oh yeah.
fact that you guys are advocating for the fact of enhancing these steps and understanding the situation and helping people go through them, but also not disqualifying what they're going through at the same time is something that's truly important. Going along with that, we mentioned from the younger generations all the way to running an operation. What's one actionable step that the listeners can take to support mental health awareness and care in agriculture?
I'm always a big champion for the idea of I'll use that term introspection again. I think just being very familiar with your scenario, like having that situational awareness of what you're going through, what you're dealing with. We kind of jokingly refer to it as, just understanding how stuck you really are. Like eh, if you're out in the field or something in your truck or on a piece of equipment, all of a sudden wheels start spinning and it gets stuck. Like, are you really just going to mat the gas and get buried that much more, or do you kind of need to step out and evaluate the situation? And I think that we as individuals are kind of really no different. Sometimes rather than just like life's happening to us at warp speed and we're just reacting, sometimes you end up like you do just I think to use your terms, you said just pause and reflect for a little bit. And we've got to do that. Just do that introspection or that situational analysis, figure out where we are. The other thing that I think is just a really actionable piece, and it's it's so easy to say, well, I got friends or I got family or I got this, but I would just challenge anybody to really think about who your go-to people are. I'm talking about like your real network. And yeah, we may have a lot of acquaintances or we may have a lot of friends and everything, but and a psychologist that I really admire, he put it this way to me one time. He said, if you don't have a short list of a handful of people that you can call right now to openly talk about whatever it is you may be going through, and who will listen to you non-judgmentally and who will just support you, you really need to start thinking about making that list. And that's always stuck with me. And I would recommend that to, both of you, to whoever's listening. I think your network is valuable. Who you're surrounding yourself with is valuable. And then also understanding who that short list of people are that you know good and well. If you're in the thick of it, you can reach out to them for support.
Definitely. I feel like that circle that we have of being able to make those connections with people and rely on them, especially in times of need, relating back to like the farming industry, we need to like share that to people. And definitely through this podcast, that's a great way to tell that to the younger generations, especially if it's like figure out who your small list is and just take a time to stop and reflect and just think. And I think that especially even not even talking about the agriculture spectrum, but even to some of our high schoolers, if they just took a second to think about who can we rely on, who can I talk about to these uncomfortable conversations where I may be struggling right now, but who can I talk to? And those lists is definitely a great way for our farmers, our agriculturalists, or just an everyday person to just take a second to reflect and just talk to the people that care about you most. Definitely.
Absolutely.
So, our final question for this podcast episode is going to be, being a past FFA member yourself, and a state FFA president, what from your days in the Blue Jacket helped you or pushed you to be where you are today?
Oh man, question. I have all sorts of cool memories. Um, but I would say of all the different contests and trips and all the different things that we ever did during FFA, one of the things that stands out the most to me was actually I just enjoyed interacting with people. I enjoyed, and we would go to the contest, and something that I really liked was you would get the chance to see all these people from all these different chapters and all over the area and stuff. And sometimes, like, you got done with your CDE with your contest, and then you're all just kind of hanging out and shooting the breeze and telling stories. And we'd sit around and we would joke and we would tell stories. And what I'm getting to is that I was in middle school, and the current state officers at the time, they came over, and I can't remember what event it was, but like you start off at the beginning. I think they've changed the annual scheduling around a little bit. We always had forestry really early in the year, and we did forestry, and like then next thing you know, you're seeing the state officers routinely at all these events, and we'd sit around and talk to these state officers and tell jokes and tell stories. And they told me, they're like, we're going to sign you up for the state convention talent show. And I'm like, whatever. And sure enough, we get to state convention and I'm signed up for the talent show. And I got up and was nervous as could be, but got up there and just started telling jokes and telling stories. And I'm pretty sure like almost every year after that, like somehow or another, me and possibly even like a group of other FFA members, like we would get up on stage at state convention and just tell stories and tell jokes, and probably like some of the worst talent at the talent show. But I say all that to point out, like, it was just so cool to get to talk to people, and it wasn't in the constraints of having to memorize a speech and go and deliver this like perfectly polished deal. It was just connecting with people and telling stories, and that's what I loved. And I think that's actually something that I've carried into my professional life and my personal life now, is like that's part of what you're trying to do as a communicator, especially like within ag communications and everything now. It's we're we're telling stories. And when we're working in the ag industry, a lot of times we have some really cool stories to tell. So I I share that with you too, also, because I mean, props to y'all. Y'all got some cool stuff to be talking about on your podcast, and so I'm looking forward to seeing how you continue to tell stories of your own, and tell other people's stories too.
Of course, thank you. It's just a cool story to tell. I mean, I wish I could go to state convention and see a comedy show basically on stage. I feel like that's just bound to be funny every single time. Even if you don't think it was funny, I feel like I'd still laugh at it. But yeah, it's genuinely so cool how at every single contest, conference, there's so many things across the year that you get to meet one person and then you see them over and over and over again. And every single time it's almost like a new introduction. Like it's like you're meeting not a completely new person, but you're hearing a new side of them every single time because they have new stories. They're going through different things because you guys are kind of growing together. And I think that's super cool to see at every single conference and then going into state convention and then obviously as you guys grow up and then eventually age out and see where you guys go after FFA.
Oh yeah.
With that, that was our last question. So thank you so much, Marshall, for being able to come on the podcast and talk to us a little bit about who you are, Mind Your Melon, and yeah.
With that being said, I believe we've just concluded episode 2 of season 2 of the Blue and Gold Radio. Thank you so much, Marshall, for joining us today. And thank you all to the listeners for tuning in and hearing the inspiring words of Mr. Marshall Sewell. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye.